Hey everybody, how are you? How are you? Okay, so what I want to share with you today is I want to share with you a little bit, go into exactly what this section is going to be about, and that is something called a literacy narrative. Literacy narrative, and if you've never heard of that before, um, what it's essentially talking about is where you learned your literacy, where you developed your literacy. Um, and the first thing I actually want to just kind of hammer out is the term literacy. Now, I think when a lot of us hear the term literacy, we think about literacy, reading and writing. And that's definitely true. It's definitely true. But literate really means educated, right? Someone who's educated in something. And so when we think about becoming literate, literacy, I want you to think about when you learned how to do something, when you learned or when you were educated on how to do something. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind for a moment, because that's what we're going to be talking about here for the next couple of weeks. When you were educated on how to do something, when you became literate on how to do something. So literacy narrative. Okay, so what are we going to be talking about here for the next couple of weeks? So you probably noticed if you've been kind of exploring here a little bit that this first section has a ton of reading. I know that a ton of reading, a lot of reading, and I apologize for that. All sections aren't really going to be like that, but this first section there is a lot of reading, a lot of reading. So um, I'm hopeful and grateful that all of you are hopefully, I'm glad that you're keeping up. I appreciate it. But the section I really want to focus on today is chapter 10 in your handbook. Of course, your handbook's right here. I think I mentioned to you in an earlier video, your screen might not look exactly like mine. That's okay. Most of the stuff that you see is here. So what we want to do is go to our first lesson. So in the literacy narrative section here, we want to go to lesson one here. So again, I know it's kind of overwhelming. A lot of stuff here in this first section. A lot of stuff, a lot of reading. Again, thank you for keeping up. There's a lot of stuff. It seems like every day. It's kind of crazy, kind of normal for a summer class. But again, I appreciate you keeping up with everything. But the important reading for this section, kind of the key chapter, the key reading for this entire section, the literacy narrative, is this one here in item number 6B, and that's chapter 10 here, writing a literacy narrative. So this is kind of what I want to go through here today, is just kind of, I won't read word for word, but just a brief overview on exactly what a literacy narrative is. And so essentially, chapter 10 here, literacy narrative, and you'll see here, right, it talks about what this literacy thing is. And it doesn't just tell you that, hey, literacy is reading and writing, when you learn to read and write. Although that is a big part of it, right? And a lot of you might choose to discuss when you learn to read and write, but it could be other things too, right? It could be, um, you know, uh, when you learned how to work a computer or other things. Um, it could be lots of different things. And, we're going to read some stuff or learn about some stuff today about how, when one young lady learned to work on a car. So it could be anything. It could really be anything. And so this chapter kind of talks about what exactly literacy is, and um, more to the point of what a literacy narrative is. And that's essentially an essay or a writing that explains, that details, that narrates when somebody learns or develops their literacy, when they learned how to do something. And so this chapter explains all that. And you'll notice if you read through this, and it's a pretty short chapter, it begins with three short narratives, three short essays. And I'm not going to, of course, I'm going to ask you to read each of these pretty carefully. And you'll see the first three stories are literacy narratives. Your first paper is going to be very similar to these three. And so this first one talks about this lady here, how she, the title here is Becoming an American Girl. And so she talks about this essay talks about how she learned her literacy by, learning to speak English, learning to speak what became her native language. So she developed her literacy by, she was from a different country and she learned how to speak a different language. Her different language, of course, became English. So here's one example of a literacy narrative. There's a second essay, that another short essay with a different kind of literacy narrative. Again, very similar. A college student describing her literacy narrative, where she was in a family who spoke a different language, and she developed um, a literacy, learning how to speak the language of her family. Some of you might be able to relate to some of these stories, by the way. But all of these chapters, incidentally, and all of the sections that we'll be doing this semester, will have these kind of example um, essays in that you can kind of look for as examples. Um, so they can all be very helpful to you. So please read these short little narratives. The last one is, as I said, this is from a lady who worked in her parents' auto shop. And she learned how to work on cars, right? So not necessarily learning how to read and write, but instead learning how to work on cars, learning the lingo of car shop, which is kind of interesting, right? We sometimes think of the term literacy as learning how to read and write. This young lady learned how to work on cars and learn the lingo of car shops. So kind of interesting. So again, kind of describing, giving you some examples of what a literacy narrative is. And then right after this section is something that's very, very important. You're going to see this a lot, this section. Every section that we're going to be doing, whether it's literacy narrative or some of the other sections in this course, has something called key features. Key features. And what these are unique features or interesting things that are significant, that are unique to this style of writing. For example, in literacy narratives, for example, all literacy narratives have these three key features that are unique to them. You'll notice them in every good literacy narrative. For example, all literacy narratives have, as part of the narratives, they're a well-told story. For instance, as with most narratives, these are about literacy, often set up for some sort of situation that needs to be resolved. That need for resolution makes readers want to keep reading, right? They're really, really interesting. Usually there's lots of really interesting details in there. And so when you read this literacy narrative, you think to yourself, well, that's really interesting. I want to keep reading. It's a very interesting story. It's a well-told story. And so as it says here, the first story that I just mentioned, the American Girl story, it's very interesting. It's a well-told story. It makes you want to keep reading it. And so I mentioned this because when you're going to write your literacy narrative later, you're going to want to make sure that it's a well-told story. You're not going to want to, it's not going to want to be rambling and, kind of disjointed and all over the place. You want to make sure that it's, that, for example, there's a need for resolution. The reader's going to want to keep reading, right? Which is going to have to be interesting, well-developed, that kind of thing. Moreover, there's vivid details, right? Kind of like if you've ever done memoir writing before, that kind of personal narrative stuff. There's vivid details in literacy narratives. If you go back and look at some of those three previous examples I showed you, all of them have vivid details. I often tell people, just like memoir writing, if you've ever done memoir writing before, they appeal to the reader's five senses, right? So if you read them, the writers write in such a way using really descriptive language that you can almost smell what's happening. You can almost taste what's happening. You can almost hear what's happening, see what's happening, right? It appeals to the reader's five senses, right? As it says here, details can bring a narrative to life for readers by giving them vivid mental sensations for the sights, the sounds, the smells, the taste, and the textures. It's like you can feel what's happening, see what's happening, all that kind of stuff, right? Vivid details. So again, as you're thinking about here the next couple of days, you know, what did I learn how to do when I was learning how to read? What kind of details? What kind of details? When I learned how to throw a baseball or when I learned how to play the trumpet, think about all these really great details, right? So all three of these key features, and lastly, some indication of the narrative's significance. Why was it so important to you? So when you go back and look at, again, these three stories, this one, and this one, you will find, in fact, the first one has all these really cool, these cool little uh, annotations here that sort of tell you this library is a key to her literacy development. All these things emphasizes the moment of significance. More details here. The significance of her reading becomes clear to her, right? So this one kind of gives you hints on where to look, but you'll notice them. Notice all these key features in every one of these stories. If you read through this one, you'll notice those same things. That it's a well-told story. There's some great details in here. You'll notice why learning the language of her family was so significant to her. And in this last one, the automotive literacy one, you'll notice why it was so important. It's a well-told story. You will notice these three key features within this literacy narrative. All three of these have to be part of a literacy narrative. So when you're thinking of your literacy narrative here the next couple of days, be thinking of those three because they have to be part of your particular paper, right? You can't just randomly say, oh, I learned how to write when I was 7. And, I did this and I did that. And thank you very much. That's the end of my story, right? There's obviously more to it. There's more to it as you're putting together a paper. And so this chapter tells you all this stuff, right? And then later on, whoops, went a little too far there. A little bit later on, it gives you some information, right? You can watch this video here, and it gives you a little bit of a guide to writing literacy narratives. If you want a topic, if you're thinking, okay, what exactly I want to write about, this section here gives you some ideas for a topic, maybe an early memory about writing, reading, speaking, maybe someone who taught you how to read or write, and some other things like that. I'm going to have another video posted, actually a couple, that will give you some more advice. I've got a couple, and if you haven't seen them already, some examples of how other students have approached this paper. So you'll see other examples of student essays of how they actually wrote this paper. So you'll have lots and lots of different examples of how other students have written essays similar to what you're going to be writing. Okay, so that's kind of this is a pretty short chapter here, but that's kind of it on how to tackle a literacy narrative. So again, I know there's a lot of stuff in this chapter. Chapter 10, as we just went over, is the crux of the literacy narrative. All these other little readings are exceedingly helpful. They talk about things like, actually structuring the essay, the beginning, the middle, and the end, that kind of stuff. You're going to have another reading this section that's still another example of a literacy narrative. So you're going to have lots and lots of examples this section on exactly how people learn to do something, how they develop their literacy in several different ways. So that's really this section that we're going to be working on, the whole notion of literacy narrative. So you're going to see a few more examples. You'll see different examples, different sample papers, things like that. A little bit later on next week, or actually the second week of this section, we'll be putting together a thesis that will help you develop and help you with the structure of your paper. That will really help you kind of finalize and put together your actual narrative. So anyway, That's that. If you have any questions on any of this, please let me know. Otherwise, good luck. Look forward to seeing all of your narratives and discovering how you all developed your literacy. Good luck, everyone. Take care.